Okay, wow, it even quieted down up here. Hey everyone, well, thank you for making it to Friday afternoon at LastCon. I was just saying if we had more attendees in the audience than panelists, we were going to be successful. So you guys have far outnumbered us for Friday afternoon. So my name is Derek Weeks. In April of this year, I was lucky enough to lead a survey of over 3,300 application security and development professionals on their use of open source and open source components within development. And we found out some very interesting things within that survey, some of which you've seen on the infographic handed out there, but we wanted to have a discussion on that through the through this hour or 45 minutes with the panel discussion. So important about the survey, we asked 28 questions. We had participants from companies that had as few as 10 employees or as few as 10 developers up to hundreds and thousands of developers. We crossed all industries from technology companies to banking and finance to government, media and entertainment, manufacturing, you name it. We had everyone from application security professionals and pen testers, developers, enterprise architects, and so forth participating in this. In the 4 years that we've run this study, we've now had over 11,000 participants within the survey, and we can start to identify some trends, which you'll see some of here throughout the discussion this afternoon. So part of this, and you may be asking, so why, in terms of open source and development and application security, why is this important? I'll set a little context for you. Is Sonatype, where I work, we are the hosts, the stewards of the central repository. If you're a Java developer, you've likely been to the central repository to get your open source components. Last year, in 2013, we managed nearly 13 billion download requests from Central. 13 billion. There are only about 11 million developers in total worldwide. A modern application probably has about 90% of its footprint in open source components because we want to be more agile. We want to speed up development, right? There are a lot of benefits to using open source within our applications, and at Sonatype we are extreme advocates of using open source and supporting the tools that do that. And of course, last year with the introduction of A9, the OWASP A9 to the top 10 list, don't use components with known vulnerabilities in your applications. A basic rule for development to follow and for application security to be aware of. So as part of the discussion, I think you guys know most of the panelists up here. Oleg Grib. Oleg comes to us. He does, I told them I'll keep the introduction short. He does security stuff. He's a security engineer. He develops open source components in the security, identity management space, as well as other things, and likes to get his hands dirty when it comes to secure application development life cycles. Ryan Berg, he's a colleague of mine at Sonatype and our chief security officer, also a co-founder of Ounce Labs in the static security analysis space. Sorry. Loves to cook, loves a mean barbecue as well. So James Wickett, I think we all know. So let's give James a round of applause. This has been a great conference. We really appreciate everything that James, you've done to organize it and bring us all together, and some great conversations over the last couple of days. And yeah, he does security stuff too, and lives by a moon culture in his family, we found out in yesterday's presentation. If you weren't there, you'll have to ask him about that. Matt Tesoro, another guy that does application stuff, security stuff, a big fan as well as James on DevOps related topics and so forth. If these guys say anything tweetable, their Twitter addresses are up there. Before we get into the meat of some of the stats to share with you, and one thing that I talked to the guys on the panel about, the stats are going to be interesting. You may find them surprising. You may find them not surprising in terms of what people said. But what I really wanted these guys to do is to talk about the information in terms of what can you use from this information to take back to your organizations on Monday and sit down and start having conversations that can make an impact. So that's where we really want to drive the discussion through the survey. So quick show of hands, how many of you are development guys, development professionals? Okay, how many?
I always quantify development professional meaning you've committed code within the last week.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Security guys, security geeks. Okay, so kind of about half and half throughout the room. Okay, first question in the survey that we asked people, how many of you specifically have had or suspected a breach in the last 12 months related to an open source vulnerability? So none of you will admit this, but if you have a friend that you know that has had or suspected a breach, raise your hands. Okay, so actually not that many, maybe 5%. In the survey, they actually admitted, so again, we had 3,300 participate in this year's version of the survey. 373 said, we admit in the last 12 months that we know or suspect there was an open source related breach or vulnerability within our organization. So if you look at that and consider that, James, we'll start with you. From a, well, just start with the middle. So when it comes to open source vulnerabilities, how rugged does a development organization need to be in terms of trying to set themselves up to manage this risk?
Well, first I'll say the moon culture in my family is way less mystic than it sounds. Yeah. Yeah.
He's got a blog on it coming out Monday.
That's right, yeah. The rugged moon approach. No, I think that, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so basically when it comes to rugged DevOps,
yeah.
Right? If we see, basically 1 in 10 organizations said, we have or suspect that we've had an open source breach, right? What can rugged DevOps do to contribute to either helping with this risk problem or helping organizations out there if you're facing this, how could rugged DevOps help them?
Yeah, okay, so when you think about, rugged and DevOps and join them together, it's even more overloaded, right? Then you're not really sure what does that even mean anymore, right? Sometimes, but I think if you take some common approaches, and so one of the things that was mentioned in the rugged track on day one by Lance, he was talking about how when we take an approach where we we have maintainability, and he was really kind of emphasizing that aspect of it. And if you do something that's maintainable, it's like you're limiting your dependencies on other type of things. So if you're instead of like actively calling over to the central repository or to Ruby gems or something like that, kind of in your build up or deploy, and you really you can affirm what version of whatever is actually on your system. I think that is a meaningful statement that you can do. And one time I was at a conference. This is kind of maybe 5 years ago, but we were talking about the cloud, and it was a security conference, so it was like cloud, that we hate it, right? And it's really bad. And I was like, well, we do stuff in the cloud, and I was just wondering if in your organization, can you tell me what all the versions of everything that's running inside of your system, what they are? And I was like, no. And I was like, oh, well, could you trace okay, forget versions of dependencies and stuff. Can you trace your code to an actual commit that's running in your cloud or in your system to like what's in source control. It's like no, and so cloud, we know that cloud doesn't like enable that. You can still do like bad things, in any system that you're using. But some of the principles and practices behind DevOps and rugged would say, okay, bundle those or have those in some sort of like known state, and you're actually talking about those in some state. So you may not prevent being hacked, and you may not prevent like being exploited, but you could say, oh, I know that version 1.73 is bad, so now I need to go find out where in my infrastructure that is, and I would have like a better a better idea of where that lives instead of kind of Wild West.
So take an inventory or have a bill of materials for what have you ever used within your application. So if something comes out, the next Poodle, the next Bash, the next Heartbleed.
It's the idea that if your infrastructure, the whole idea of infrastructure as code, right? If your infrastructure really is represented as code, then you should be able to trace back to like where that came from, even if you haven't done like a real full audit or anything like that. Like it's kind of already built into the system natively.
So Matt, we'll ask you, from a secure development lifecycle perspective, do we have enough awareness around open source vulnerabilities? I mean, this year kind of changed everything. Poodle, Bash, Heartbleed, you name the logo or the nickname or...
Yeah, we need a good fancy name for this problem, I guess. That the sexy name and logos are important. But I mean, I would definitely second what James said, and I'd like to add to that one of those things, if you are doing your source code correctly, right, knowing if you have a vulnerable, let's say you know that some particular Ruby gem is vulnerable, and you're a Ruby shop. Well, it's a matter of pulling the right version out of Git and doing a grep to find out, right? If you have confidence to know that this is the version that's running in production, right? And I know at Rackspace we do a ton of threat modeling, and I kind of cheat and call it threat modeling plus because I got everybody in the room who's key to that app. I like to ask a million questions that aren't really related to the threat model, but it gives me an asset inventory of that thing I'm threat modeling. What are you running on? What's the web server? What's the framework, right? And there are times, if you're cognizant of this, you can get this information sort of on the side, and it kind of goes with what I said in my talk the other day, is I really like organic systems. So we didn't have, and we don't really have truly a full asset thing for Rackspace, but for everything we threat modeled, we have a really good idea of what the heck that's running, right? So this allows you to over time build up this inventory, right? You're never gonna be given the 6 months to inventory everything, but every time you run into something that's inventoriable, find a good place to put it and then start putting stuff there, right? It's kind of, if you can get this mindset, you can at least start to get ahead of the problem.
Right, yeah, going out inventorying everything. I've talked to people here that said we're under that process, and like, oh my gosh, that's gonna take months or years if you could even complete it. But a good way to approach it is, hey, let's start with what we have, right? With what's in development right now. Even if there are 10 previous versions of that application, why don't we try and take an inventory of that and start from this point on is a place to start. So we're going to shift to the next topic. Out of all of you out there, how many of your organizations have an open source policy in place? Written, automated, word of mouth we're supposed to follow? Wow, okay, raise of hands, really? Like raise them high, because I didn't see very many there. Okay, maybe 20%, right? 30% maybe? Okay, so within the survey, 50, this is a little backward in terms of how we presented. So 43% said they don't have an open source policy. So 57% of organizations had an open source policy in place, written, automated, what have you. Down significantly year over year. So I'm not sure why that particular downtrend occurred in terms of open source policies out there. But the other interesting thing that we ask in the survey, and I think it's on the infographic there, out of those that have an open source policy, 68% follow it. Right? So we have 57% that have a policy, and of those, 68% are actually...
Well, yeah, and I think if you look at the stats, the other interesting thing was that the number of people that got a policy increased, but the number of people that actually filed the policy decreased. So more people have a policy, but less people are actually following it. So that's sort of a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah. So Oleg, I know we've talked about this before. Are we at a good state of things? Because a lot of people look at this and say, hey, Derek, you're open source bashing, right? But give me some historical perspective.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to talk about my friend's experience, not about my own experience.
That's why we're here. We all have friends in need.
Yeah, so like approximately 15 years ago, a friend of mine was sitting in an architectural board, and they were considering a very revolutionary topic. Should we allow open source in our big financial, very conservative organization? It was very revolutionary at that time, and the decision was, of course, no. We cannot take this risk. And of course, we can all laugh at them now. But there is two parts in this decision. One is that they decided not to use it at all. We cannot do it nowadays, no matter what kind of organization it is. But the second part is actually not laughable at all. The second part was related to real concern. Who is going to support it? If something bad happens, security or functionality is impacted, who is going to fix it, and how fast this is going to happen? This is all valid questions. And if you look at the state of affairs everywhere in my friends' companies, then you will notice that it's still a very valid concern, and nobody is good in addressing that properly, right? So I've seen different kind of policies. So some policies were mostly concerned about legal aspects of using third-party software, and they were scared by cases like Cisco with their litigation case related to open source used in their, I think it was IS, their proprietary operating system.
Sued for IP risk.
Yeah. So this aspect is understood, but when it comes to security and supportability, the approach is very naive, even in mid-sized organization. So business wants to take all benefits of open source, but they don't want to pay anything for that, to put it simple. This is what I've seen a lot. And when you go to startups, it's even worse, because nobody cares where this code came from. They just want to push it as fast as possible to market, because if they don't do that, they're not going to get the next round on financing from the venture capitalists.
So Ryan, you're the chief security officer of a startup company. Do you have an open source policy? And for those of the audience out there that don't, where should they start? That's a small question. You have 30 seconds.
I have 30 seconds. Well, I mean, it's interesting because for me, we're still sort of in somewhat of an echo chamber. I mean, I came back from North Carolina on Wednesday, and I was speaking at the All Things Open, and there was another group of people, but it was all developers. I asked a very similar question, right? How many people, use components? Oh, okay, yeah, we love components. It's the greatest thing. It's making my life better. I said, so how many of you guys actually pay attention to any security issues? And they're like, oh yeah. So how many people watch NVD? And they're like, so I asked the following question: how many people know what NVD was? Right? One guy in the back, he's like, yeah. So it's somewhat of an echo chamber. Right? I mean, having a policy is an important thing, but you have to first get to a point to realize that you're using all these things and coming up with how do you actually use them? Where are they? In what context are you using them? Because having a spreadsheet that says you're allowed to use these 10 components or these 100 components, it's sort of like putting the cart before the horse, right? Because immediately if you don't think about holistically how your organization is consuming software, do you have the ability to understand where those places are, then inevitably your policy is going to be incorrect. And then once your policy sort of fails, then everyone goes around the policy. That's the reason why we have that slide which says, oh, how many people have a policy? Yes. How many people actually follow the policy? Nobody does. Right? Because the policy becomes this thing which is, some security guy from Mount Zion comes down and says, you must do X.
Here's the security tax.
Right,
and
all the developers sorry, dude, but this is not going to work. So, okay, yeah, you want me to submit every version of every library that I possibly use? I mean, I just recently got a question the other day. Someone was doing due diligence for a friend of mine's company. And one of the due diligence requests was, all right, tell me all the open source software that you use. And I was like, okay, well, so do you use any sort of JavaScript? Well, we use jQuery. I'm like, how far do you go, right? You use one jQuery library with 10 dozen plugins. It's like amazing how much open source they have. So oftentimes that question, to me, is getting less and less of the relevant question, right? Not what open source is using, it's more what context are you using it in? Do you have the ability to even understand where you're using it and why you're using this piece of software in this context? Because that's where the important risk decisions come from. Are you using GPL? GPL doesn't matter if you're not redistributing your code. So the wrong question is you shouldn't be using GPL. It's not the right question at all. If you're using a SaaS service, the real relevant question is, are you using any GPL? Right? So we have to get to a point where we will understand what software we have, where it is, and then apply the business context on top of that before we get to the real policy decision. Because you've already failed. If you're at policy first and you can't answer those first questions, you've already failed.
So I'm going to change topics, but go back to something that Oleg said. I'm going to ask James to comment on. In the organization, when we're looking at open source policies, governance, like, look, we all will use it. You cannot stop an organization from using open source components. We had a customer, we told them, like, hey, you've downloaded 3 million open source components in the last year. They're a huge financial institution. And of those, there were X number of vulnerable components in those software. And the bank's reaction, we're just going to stop using open source. And the answer to that was, okay, shut down the bank, right? You're not going to stop this from happening. So knowing we're not going to stop it from happening, and there are some risks that there are no free kittens in open source. Who owns this problem? Is it DevOps operations? Is it IT architecture? Is it the security guys out here?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Matt, what do you think?
Oh, hand off the mic. I'll expound. Ooh, that's a good one too. I would say I'm going to do the lawyer answer and say it depends, and it kind of depends on your corporate culture, right? I know at Rackspace, even amongst our teams, there's very different culture. And so really, I think the security group should probably help drive that conversation, but who actually manages and tracks that is very different based on how your company is laid out. Like, I will gladly hand down the mic. But it is very important to just at least be, one, aware of it and start working on it. I completely agree with your thing about, though, not like saying banning open source is ridiculous. I mean, you're not going to write it all yourself. Yes, we'd like to take 4 times as long to get to market. That's a winning solution, right? That's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there is some burden that you have to put on your engineering team for it's like, okay, you're using this stuff, like be involved in the knowledge of what it is you're using. We trust you. I mean, I may not be the best person to answer for that because it's like we let the person who writes the code deploys it to production. It's like we give full kind of access to people for that. So, but I do think there is like some trust that needs to happen there. But maybe there needs to be that cognitive recognition that like, oh yeah, I need to actually care about like these libraries and these things that I'm using and be knowledgeable of that.
So, yeah. Oh, I'm stealing the mic before it goes back down. Sorry. I wanted to mention something. You brought something to mind. Like this is why I mean this is a shared burden, right? You're writing a Python app, let's say. You have a requirements.txt that lists the pip installs, right? If you're not producing that as part of your dev process, as a developer, you failed, right? I mean, but now, do I need to actually inventory that? No, but I need to make sure that exists. Now, maybe the security group is going to go pull those out of GitHub and keep track with NVD against what's listed in the pip installs, right? I mean, this is not I don't think this falls under one group. I think a lot of people have to share this burden.
Yeah, and I think let Oleg have the mic because he's
Yeah, I don't know why this is even a question who is responsible because let's just take a look at the target case, right?
Yeah.
So
okay.
Third-party code has been used very similar to open source. It's probably not open source, but doesn't matter. It's third-party because open source is a third-party, right?
Yeah.
And then it was POS software, right? And then was black POS that was installed on top of that. So who is responsible? Would you blame the vendor? I don't think so. Target was responsible, and if you're talking about responsibility before the customers, then this is an organization who is responsible. Then when you go inside the organization and want actually to assign a blame to somebody, then it's not a brainer for me either, because the one who supports the system, in this particular case, they're like IT, organization is responsible, right?
Yeah. Well, who got blamed at Target? The CIO is no longer there, right? So clearly he got blamed.
So what
Maybe
to do?
it's a C-level issue.
So what to do about this? Like, because you were asking question, what to do? What kind of lessons we should learn? We basically need to make sure that all our security processes and controls cover security end to end. So we should not like take it our system in pieces and say, we develop this code, we're responsible for it. No, you are responsible for the whole system end to end. So in all your security testing, QA testing, you should include use cases that will cover all the stack. From the front end to the back end, everything should be tested. This is the only way how you can solve this problem in my view.
Well, I think in some sense, right, the who responsible is, as you mentioned, is really somewhat of the wrong question, right? Because the organization is responsible. But the more important thing is that everyone in the organization needs to understand who's got the ball. And there's not enough of that in organizations. Because development says, oh yeah, we've got a security team for that. Right? And security says, oh no, I think development's doing that. And then, or it's legal's responsibility. So everyone is doing one of these. Ultimately, the organization is responsible, but everyone in the organization is not aligned on who really has the ball, at what point in time, and for what kind of thing. So that's, to me, the sort of the bigger question, is that you have to understand in your organization, it's bigger, right? These things cross functions, right? It's legal, it's dev, it's security, but everyone needs to understand what role do they play and when do they play? When do they get the pass? And because when the guy's not looking for the ball, what happens? Right? He gets hit in the face. And to me, that's what's happening. A lot of people are getting hit in the face because nobody knows who's got the ball and when.
Yeah, I think that it's a good I was going to say it's a good conversation to bring back on Monday is, so let's say from what I've heard in the panel, right, not one person is going to be responsible. Okay, so I think we might all agree on that. In the survey responses said that the responsibilities were kind of all over the place. So if not everyone's responsible, but we all have a part, the conversation on Monday could be, what is our part? What do we want to take responsibility for? Or what have we taken responsibility for? Do we need to take more responsibility in our area from here on out to be more rugged, to have a more secure development lifecycle?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to think, what if we thought about IT and technology and really the software that we're generating, the services we're providing, and we start thinking about that like manufacturing. A lot of people have talked about this, right? This idea that you start thinking of taking stuff from the 50s and 60s and like applying that to software today, and like that's the lean and all that movement that's going on right now. But it's I think it's very informative to us in how we think about it. Like if you produce cars that the brake pedals don't work or the ignition doesn't work, whatever. It's like they actually know how to do recalls, and they know how to do all that stuff. I mean, it didn't go smoothly. We have a lot of use cases where that doesn't work, and there's plenty of use cases or examples of how it did work. But I think that your point is like who's responsible. Like you were saying, like it's Target, right? And the whole point is like it's Ford, it's GM, or it's whatever. It's your organization. Now, your organization might be at fault for not understanding what its real product really is. And so you're making widgets and you're putting stuff into your widgets, but you don't really know that those things of what the widgets that you put inside of those little sub widgets called jQuery and other stuff like that, right? It's like, oh, I'm using these things that I don't really know what they are, but I'm producing it as a product. So I think that might actually get closer to the heart of the issue of where we're abdicating responsibility across groups whenever it's like your organization really does own that.
I think you hit on a great point, and I've talked about it a lot as well, as this idea of a supply chain, right? Of the parts that we're using, and do we know what parts there are and where they went and where they're located? Because if something goes wrong or someone tells us there's a flaw in those parts that we might have used somewhere, somehow it totally amazes me that when there is a beef recall, I mean, beef industry cannot be the most technologically advanced. Maybe I'm saying that in the wrong place, being in Texas, right? But the fact that if there's a beef recall, they can trace every package down to every store, down to the serial number to say, take that off the shelves, amazes me. Like, there's infrastructure set up to be able to support that. But if you used an open source component that has a flaw in it, like how many organizations spent days, weeks, even months were still figuring out where Heartbleed was in their organizations? The disclosures, I mean, you guys see them, they're still coming out, right? Vulnerable to OpenSSL, and we're 9 months from that, well, 6 months from that disclosure happening. So next question, I changed the slide up here. OWASP A9 was introduced, I think, last August, a year ago August, so we're now 13, 14 months since then. We have 21% of organizations must prove they're not using components with known vulnerabilities, right? So have we made, Matt, you sit on the OWASP board, have we made the progress that we expect within year one?
Well, first I'd like to qualify, I used to sit in the OWASP.
Sorry.
That's okay. So I'm not shifting blame, but I'm no longer on the board currently. But I'll still talk about this. I think the NVB, or the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, is a fantastic start. But one of the problems is, even if, let's say, you have an inventory of these things, knowing that that thing that got patched is actually vulnerable is really tricky, because there isn't, NVD is good, but it may not have all of your pips or your gems. Like, how do you know that this gem that does, I don't know, JSON dumps for you is actually vulnerable? Or it got revved from version 1 to version 2, and if you look at the changelog, even let's say you have time to look at the changelog, that security fix may have not even made the changelog. I mean, so this is a very hard to get around issue. I mean, it's complicated, and I think certainly not for Ruby or or Python, but for static language analyzable language, it would be interesting to see if, because the other thing is okay, I'm using this .NET component, and I'm using one of the 20 methods exposed by it. If I'm never calling the vulnerable method, then I actually don't need to do a fire drill to replace it. But I don't know how you know that. Yeah. Without a lot of high-tech work of a high-end person looking at the code.
Yeah, context on vulnerabilities is key. Do I need to worry? How much should I worry? We were just having a debate not really a debate, but a long discussion in the speaker room about the validity of CVSS scores, and do they really tell you the truth about what's going on? But maybe Ryan, you want to?
I mean, I'd probably debate this until the cows come home. I always.
We know where all those cows are.
Yeah.
And if they go bad, what to do with them?
Yeah. Because so a buddy of mine the other day, we were testing that out. So there happens to be a vulnerability in HSQLDB, and that particular vulnerability allows you to call any static method, right? So then you take that vulnerability and you marry that to another library which has a different vulnerability, a runtime code execution vulnerability, that's on the class path, right? But it's not being used. So we took that HSQLDB, which allows us to call a static method, to then call into a library which exposed a different vulnerability that we knew about, even though it wasn't being called in the application. So just because something is not called in the case of dynamic languages, things like Java, just because it's not being called in the code that you write, if it's on the class path, it's callable, and you are just one smart guy removed from someone figuring out some other way to get that call because it's exposed in your library. I can load it. I can load a class loader. So I always caution people from, let's not hope or rest our laurels on the fact that, oh, wait a minute, I shouldn't have to fix this because I'm not calling it. In the case of Java, guess what? It's on the class path. It's callable. Now, that being said, I debate this all the time because at the same time you can look at another application saying, well, do I have any developers, right? What's the real risk profile? Do I want to open up Pandora's box to go figure out what is the real risk here? That's the bigger discussion, not of if I have a known vulnerability and I know about it and I'm using it in my library and I have an alternative choice to not use it, you should be on a path of not using it, rather than spending all your engineering resources to prove that that's not a vulnerability, because your proof is always going to be inaccurate.
Well, another dimension of that too is like, even if you do swap this out from version 1 to version 2, do you have testing to know that you just didn't boof your application, right? I mean, yay, we're no longer vulnerable, but the thing won't start, right? Oops. Or it starts and runs for an hour or two and then it dies on customers, right? Yeah, I mean, this is a non-trivial issue.
Yeah, I agree that this is not a trivial issue, but you know, I can suggest again some approach which works for my friend. So, like, if you see like any kind of zero-day vulnerabilities coming in, it's related to open source that you are using, then the first question that my friend would ask is, can we fix it like really fast? How much time and resources will it take to fix it? And if the answer is, you know, like we can fix it like by just tweaking configuration parameters somewhere, then it's not going to affect anything. Then the question is, why not to do that? Let's just go ahead and do that. But then there are other cases. For example, I can recall Beast vulnerability. And at that time, everybody saying, oh, this is like really like critical. Criticality is very high. We need to fix it right away. And nobody really knew how to do that, because the suggestion was, let's just do it on server side. Let's just replace our server. All CBC servers, CBC ciphers are not good. Let's just use RC4. Everybody knew that RC4 is not good either. But no, this is Beast. This is like, we need to fix right away. And now, like, what is happening now, if you go to SSL test lab at Qualys, like very good actually testing harness, I love it, then you will notice that even if you have Beast, it will not be marked as an issue, and you will still get your A grade for your SSL implementation. So as it turned out, it's not really something that needs to be fixed on the server. It's like man-in-the-middle attack, and the beta mitigation is on the client, and all browsers have already fixed it. So, you know, like, what I'm trying to say, if you feel that this is not very easy to fix it, then yes, you need to go ahead and do analysis inside the organization. You need to understand what kind of data is at risk, right? And if this is like really an issue, and only after that request resources, go to a manager, escalate, and take people from other important work and do that.
So I'm a developer. I get paid to deliver new features on time, as fast as possible, to meet the customer's needs and the sales reps' needs, because they just sold the new feature. I don't have time to track new vulnerabilities in production. I'm sorry, in development. So 63% of developers said, no, we don't track any vulnerability changes to vulnerability data in development. I'm paid to get the product out the door, to help build the product. Who needs to track vulnerabilities in development, changes in vulnerability data? Is that our AppSec friends? Matt?
Well, I think this is actually comes back to the point I made earlier. This is sort of a team effort, right? I think the development teams are responsible for making it easy for the security team to discover the components they're using, right? If this is breaking apart your jar and looking in there, or looking at a Maven build, or your bundler, or your requirements.txt, what have you, right? You have some sort of way to enumerate those. I think as a developer, you're sort of owe the security team that, right? But it's the security team to take those issues and then look at what's vulnerable, because I think they're in a much better place to have the full context view. Now, they may have to consult with outside bits of the organization, like, okay, so App A does have a problem, and it is using this vulnerable component. We make $4 a week on this, but App B also has it, and we make $4 million a week on this. Let's do App B, right? I mean, like, I think the security group is in a much better place to, like, take all of this into context. Like, how exploitable is it? I don't want a developer not to knock them to make that decision, because that's just not the ball game that they play every day, right? That's sort of my shtick, right? Like, I'm not going to tell them how to fix the issue, particularly code-wise. I may or may not know, right, depending on how good I am at that language, but that's really not my ballpark either, right? So I think this really breaks down to The development group needs to make those things discoverable by the security team, and then the security team needs to take those and then make the assessment. I mean, that's hopefully why we're getting paid, because we have some gray matter between our ears, and we can hopefully make some decent judgments about if this really makes sense for the org. And it relates directly back to the points that Robert was making in his talk at 2, that this is all about context. Like, some things aren't worth fixing, period.
Yeah. So some things aren't worth fixing, I would agree. So when we look, James, at the, hey, let's track it. If we track this like other industries, like a supply chain, right? And supply chain and manufacturing and pharmaceutical and beef packaging, what have you. Today, 40% of organizations said we are tracking all dependencies and all components and all their dependencies in production, right? Are we in a good state, and are things getting better? This is, how many of you are on the side where you're tracking components and all dependencies in production? Someone in your organization has a view of that. Raise it. I see one hand, 2 hands, 3, 4. 4. No ability to do recall in this room.
Yeah. I'm surprised at 40%, honestly.
Okay, so
I would have lost that far back.
okay, so given that, and you know, maybe we don't need to, right? Maybe it's too big of an issue. What do we do on Monday? What should we ask on Monday? See, this wasn't easy to be part of this panel, right? We're
I was like,
we're
I
asking
don't
all the
know.
hard questions on Friday.
I think that if you kind of distill everything down to, like, if you had a team of one, you know, like one person has a startup and they're trying to build something and they're trying to put something out and they care about it, right? And whenever that person is doing that, they in addition to fulfilling the customer demands and all the stuff that they would do as developers, they're also saying, like, it depends on, the type of information and whatever they're dealing with, but they want their customers to have a good experience, to have vulnerable code out there, stuff that's exploitable. Like, that is bad, right? It's like, oh, I don't want, cat pictures showing up on the website, or I don't other things, to happen. But a lot of it depends on their experience. But I think sometimes if we get in that mindset of, like, the advice that we have wouldn't work all the way down to a team of one, but only works if you have 5 security people and 50 developers or whatever. I get a little, like, worried about that, and I'm like, well, I think that it should be discernible for other people. And I think how I like to think about this problem, and especially about, like, how you're managing your dependencies and how you're bundling things in, I think there's a couple things that I like. So Netflix, big organization, they do a lot of stuff, but one of the ways that they assess some of this problem is probably everybody's familiar that they, like, actually build images for each of their applications. They don't, like, spin something up and then deploy to it, and you can argue whether that's good or bad. I'm not the hugest fan of it, but it works for them. They got a whole pipeline built up for the whole thing, so it actually works. It probably wouldn't work for all organizations, but they say, okay, here is our base image that everybody starts out with and that their teams are going to pick up. And if anything, like, inside of that, like, we know that that's got a certain version of Tomcat or a certain version of whatever that they use, and their security people or whatever are really concerned about that. And that's if there's any code changes to that, if they know there's any exploits that are happening in that piece, they're kind of able to watch that. And so they put kind of watchers in their base. So I guess and I say that little story or whatever is, like, we can't just, like, radically shift how everybody does everything, like, on Monday, but we can start adding in some automation and checks in certain parts of our code base and certain parts of our infrastructure, depending on where you are, that could be meaningful and have an impact for you.
I mean, I kind of disagree with Matt a little bit. You're fine. Yeah, I disagree with Matt a little bit. I think that as an industry, if we continue down the path that we push it to the security folks, and it's the security folks that's their problem, then we will have fundamentally failed. Our industry is moving much too fast for us to wait for security to then say, well, we're the security guys, we're the experts, we're going to tell you whether it's a problem or not. I think development has to take some responsibility that when they're choosing, I mean, we need to stop looking at Stack Overflow for an article that was written 5 years ago and use that as the template for my project that I'm building today, right? That is a developer problem that security shouldn't have to inherit because they're now including all these old dependencies, old version of software, and it looks like it worked and it was an article that was 5 years old. And to me, that's a problem. Developers have an opportunity. And when they're building something, they get to select at that time what are they going to use. They should have the ability to understand, am I using something that I shouldn't use? Or instead of just, I'm going to give security the bill of materials when I'm done, and then they're going to decide whether I should have used that. Because that's oftentimes that gets you to the hope and pray moment, right? We're right about the ship. And it's really vulnerable. And security says I shouldn't use this, but we can't, you know how much time, if I need to upgrade to this new version, we're going to delay the release by 5 months. So then what everybody does, they go, how risky is this? How likely is this going to occur? Okay, cross our fingers, we're shipping, right? And we need to get away from that. And the only way, or one way that I think of, is that we have to make developers more accountable at the time they're choosing these things in the first place. That's an organizational shift. I don't know if any of you, I mean, you probably all watch YouTube. I highly recommend you go watch a video. A guy, I think it was the CTO of Wufoo. You may not know Wufoo, but he did a startup lab at Stanford University. Went and spoke about Wufoo and how they design stuff. And one of the things that they did was they made developers do support. Every developer had to do support. Because what happens is that every time there was an issue that came in, right, developer said, if I get the same issue 3 times, or they hear the customer's pain at the other end saying, oh my God, this button that you added, it wrecked my day, then the developer goes and he goes, I'm going to go fix this, right? And they reduce their overall support costs dramatically by having developers fundamentally responsible for that activity. Making developers fundamentally responsible for a piece of security where they are at the front lines, I think is the only way we're going to begin to shift and move this needle. We can't just keep pushing to security folks. There's just not enough of us.
I think there's...
One quick comment, because I don't disagree with what you're saying, actually. I think that's true. And I'm somewhat fortunate because we're a rather progressive company at Rackspace. And so one of our teams, the dev team actually tracks 500s and then finds it does basically walk through the get blame to see who did it. So I mean, I'm lucky. I have a very good team. So I'm getting good output from our dev team. So, but you're right. In some other shops where you may not have that high level of developer, that is going to be a problem. And quite honestly, that assumes that you have a security person that is that skilled in AppSec anyway, that wasn't the firewall dude who's now wearing the AppSec hat.
I think if we look at known vulnerabilities, so there's an open source component framework library with a known vulnerability, right? It should be, I agree, the responsibility of the developer to understand that and not use it. But in addition, because I would say that's got to be controversial for half the room out here that's developers. You guys are now the responsible person, but the organization has to find a way to empower the developer to actually have the information. You're consuming hundreds or thousands of open source components a year as a developer. You can't spend time going out to the National Vulnerability Database, you're nodding big time over here, for every component that you select to prove hey, okay, I'm following A9, I went out, I proved there's no known vulnerability here. If the organization can't find ways to empower the developer to have information in a way that's not going to tax or overly burden, hey, yeah, we can go out and check every single component, and every developer in our organization can do that and check all those components. We're just going to delay our release cycle by 3x, right? That's fine, right? We don't need to ship this year, this month, right? So I think there's part responsibility, I would agree, but that empowerment side we've got to figure out, because the consumption volume is so high, right? Just look, so as I mentioned on the central repository, just hosting Java components, right? There are 800,000 different component versions in that thing. 13 billion download requests just from that, from 11 million developers. The consumption volume is too high to go out and manually approach this issue. right? You have to be empowered somehow within your organization to have a way to find that information or have people find it for you, because it won't keep up. The manual spreadsheet thing won't keep up.
You know, but we talked about, just briefly, we talked about the discussion to have, right? This is the discussion to have, right? This problem isn't going away. It's accelerating. I think of, we talk about deployable infrastructure with like Docker, you know, I look at that and I'm like, okay, well that's the next thing, right? Because people are just downloading Docker images from who knows where, or Ansible deployment playbooks, which can be recursive in nature, and like, oh yeah, what could possibly go wrong downloading some random playbook from Joe Schmo that's executing code on my server? Probably nothing.
Dude, I saved so much time doing that.
I'm kind of mad at you right now. I mean, you've ruined my pipeline for getting things done. I mean, I can't use Stack Overflow and Docker and Ansible. I use Chef, but it's the same idea. Like, what am I supposed to do now? And I think that there's a real conversation to be had too. It's like, you know, as a developer working on the front end, and I should actually know what is up with jQuery and like how I'm using it. But well, do I know what version of OpenSSL is sitting on my Ubuntu box, or what version of Ubuntu I'm? You know, probably not. You know, like it's like facilitating conversation between groups of people that have that like knowledge. You know, like to be able to talk about those different things is really helpful, because, I mean, you could take this all the way down to like operating system and whatever. I mean, it's like, so the whole stack is really in question here, and that's why you kind of have that convergence of the different groups to take ownership as an organization. So anyways, I'm not really mad at you, but now I'm like, how do I do work tomorrow? I don't know.
I mean, I just looked at an Ansible playbook the other day where it was, someone was doing a yum install, and one of the great things of Ansible says, oh, which version do you want? Latest. You know, all right. You know, I need to have describable infrastructure. One of the great things about Maven, right, is I can dump a dependency tree and know exactly what I have. If I look at a playbook and it just says latest, what the hell is that? If you're using Ansible playbook, if I ever see one that has latest in it,
Okay. Oleg, time to disagree.
No, I'm not even going to this. I just want to return to this responsibility for security engineers question. This is what like I'm interested the most. So I think like if you don't do a detailed architecture and design analysis of your system, you're not doing your job as a security engineer. This is the first like message that I want to deliver. This is that you need to start from, right? You need to do threat modeling, you need to understand design, architecture, including, this is important, all components which your system has. It doesn't matter. This is like open source, third party, your own, you need to understand all that. After you understand, you need to figure out what kind of attack vectors for each of these components you might have. After you understand that, you need to put a proper mitigation controls in place, right? Yeah. After this is done, you need like really to be ready to address security incidents when they are happening. And this is when it's not appropriate to divide responsibility. This is like everybody's responsibility in the team. When incident is happening, you need to have one team, not just security, development, legal, communication. All of them needs to be on board, and everybody needs to know what they should do in this situation. Returning to security responsibility in this incident response and incident investigation procedure, the first thing that they would need to do is to understand how they did it, right? After they understood that, they would need to come up very quickly in real time with a fix, how it should be fixed, and communicate it to developers team. Developers team needs to be working with the QA operations to put a fix in place. It needs to be verified by QA and by security engineer. So if you have all of this in place, then you can deal with this threats.
I think that's a great point. It's where to take the responsibility, right? And you need to take the responsibility, right? The latest isn't a good enough requirement, in your playbook, right? Last question up here, because I know we're getting toward the end of time for the session. Training. So I think it's nearly 1 in 4 people, developers didn't receive any application security training. Can we train our way out of this?
No. And I love training, and I've taught at university level. But the problem is, and it'll always be with training, is you can train people who want to be trained. You cannot train people who don't want to be trained. So I think there's a certain amount of like education you can do, but there's also, I mean, there's ways to train without training, right? And how I mean that is, so maybe I add to a Jenkins job that a developer is using in their CI/CD that does a security thing. They don't even know, right? I mean, I didn't train them, but now it goes red, and we have a conversation about why it goes red. That's a training moment, so to speak. I think that's really how you do training. Formal sit-down training is really hard to do. Like, I want to take a dev team offline for 4 days. Like, good luck with that, right? I mean, I've done some of those, but they're rare because those dev teams are churning out code.
I think that's a great point for going back to the point I was making previously about how do you empower developers, right? So that conversation right there, right? Jenkins went red, right? Why did it go red, right? How do we know, right? How can we help you get the information that you need, that may help you see, maybe that we need to think about a different approach here.
Yeah, and it's about being collaborative and using the systems and the talk that your dev team already uses. So if they're Jenkins, if it's whatever, I mean, it doesn't really matter, but finding out how their process works and then injecting yourself into that process in such a way that you're not an interruption to the normal flow. You're just another something, right? I mean, that's why, like in my talk, I said submit bugs to the bug tracker, because you don't want a PDF, you want bugs. That's what developers deal with. They deal with bugs, right? They don't deal with PDFs. I don't even like PDFs, right? So I mean, it's really, but if you can do this, that's where it does become teachable, right? Because now we're talking to a dev manager about, hey, this is in your backlog and this is bad. We need to get this into a sprint, right? And now we have, why do we need it in a sprint? There's your teachable moment, right? I can explain to you why this is an issue for your bit of software and why this vulnerability matters. But it's not a sit-down training.
Yeah. So I know we're toward the end of time. The important thing, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, I mean, we went through a good number of data points here, and I think a great discussion, and clearly even for our illustrious panel of experts here, the questions aren't easy, right? And the debate is heated and strong, emotional, and opinionated across organizations. And that is, one of the reasons why we do the survey and we lead the survey is not to say, hey, 43% don't have an open source policy. It's use the survey to have this discussion, right? The full survey result, all 28 questions, including we even ask, you'll see in the deck, developers, what's your favorite pizza? Do you prefer beer over wine? So there were some fun questions in there as well. You'd be surprised that beer and water were the preference, so like almost tied within a percentage point for what they like to have with pizza. But anyway, so the full survey is available here. You can download it. There's no registration required, so you don't have to give your name or anything like that. But take it to your organizations, and on Monday, take conversations and learnings that you've had here at LastCon and start to open up the conversations about responsibility and what do we know about our code and what kind of practices or policies should we have in place. So I want to thank everyone on the panel. I want to thank all of you for staying around until 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon in Austin, when I know there's cold beer and drinks waiting for us somewhere in this town. Yeah.
It's Mopacked already.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much.
I'll be here all week.
Thank you. Okay, take care.